Good morning, this is Environmental Intelligence Episode 4 for March 3rd, 2026, your daily briefing on environmental regulatory, science, and compliance developments that matter for Canadian professionals. New Antarctic meltwater data shows minimal iron release, undermining algae bloom assumptions in global carbon models used for Canadian climate adaptation planning. Field data from West Antarctica reveals meltwater contributes far less iron to oceans than previously thought, shifting reliance to deep ocean sources and raising questions for CCME climate guidelines and federal IAA assessments incorporating carbon sequestration projections. This impacts risk assessments for coastal projects in BC and Atlantic provinces where sea level rise models assume higher algal CO2 uptake. Professionals should review IAA submissions this week for alignment with updated ocean iron dynamics. Let's dive into the lead story on this Antarctic meltwater data. It's reshaping how we think about ocean iron dynamics, and that has direct implications for our work in coastal risk assessments across several jurisdictions. The new field data comes from West Antarctica, showing that glacial meltwater provides negligible bioavailable iron for algal blooms, with concentrations clocking in below 0.1 nmol/L. That's a stark contrast to prior estimates of 1 down 10 nmol/L, which many of us have baked into our models. Instead, the data points to up to 90% of iron coming from deep ocean currents and sediments. This isn't just academic. It challenges CCME environmental quality guidelines for marine systems and federal CPA climate modeling. Why? Reduced algal CO2 sequestration could accelerate sea level rise projections by 10-20% in the models we use for things like BCCSR coastal site assessments. Previously, we assumed higher iron from meltwater would fuel more blooms, pulling down more CO2 and tempering rise rates. Now, with that assumption undermined, we're looking at potentially faster rises, which means recalibrating risk assessments under frameworks like Ontario EPAO, Reg 15304, or Alberta EPEA for sites with marine exposure. In practice, this could require enhanced flood risk mapping, think integrating more robust elevation data or scenario planning for higher inundation thresholds. Don't forget to cross-reference with Fisheries Act habitat protections, especially where ocean productivity affects species at risk. For Quebec practitioners under LQE RPRT, it's time to update contaminant transport models to account for these lower iron-driven carbon sinks. What I find interesting here is the signal for broader harmonization. Watch for CCME guideline revisions in Q2 2026. This data could push interprovincial alignment on climate adaptation thresholds, making it easier to standardize approaches for multi-jurisdiction projects. Overall, if you're handling coastal remediation or IAA assessments, this is worth pulling into your next team meeting. It might not upend everything overnight, but ignoring it could leave your projections exposed when regulators start asking questions. Shifting to regulatory and policy watch, several deadlines are closing in, so let's run through them efficiently. First, federal CPA 2024 amendments require toxic substance list updates by March 15, 2026. Submit comments on proposed PFAS additions via Canada Gazette Part 1. This impacts all provinces with harmonized thresholds, so if you're dealing with emerging contaminants, get your input in to shape those alignments. In Alberta, EPA contaminated sites reporting deadlines close March 31, 2026 for Tier 1 assessments. Make sure your Phase 2 ESAs align with the updated groundwater standards. A mismatch there could delay approvals and rack up costs. Ontario EPAO Reg 15304 record of site condition filings are due April 1, 2026 for Q1 completions. Verify ISO 17025 lab accreditation for those analytical results, or you'll be chasing revisions. And BCCSR Protocol 13 Vapor Intrusion Guidance Consultation ends March 20, 2026, affecting remediation designs in urban areas. This ties into what we've seen in Ontario and Alberta on harmonization. Feedback here could influence cross-province standards for vapor pathways. On the cross-jurisdictional side, track U.S. state-level air permit challenges like Georgia's Plant Bowen expansion for potential influence on federal Canadian carbon pricing under CPA. Cross-border smog issues might prompt tighter Alberta oil sands emission standards, so if you're in emissions modeling, keep an eye on that ripple effect. Similarly, Maryland's lobbyist disclosure audit has parallels in Canadian transparency rules, possibly affecting advocacy in Ontario EPA consultations. It's routine, but worth noting if you're involved in stakeholder engagements. Finally, the Antarctic iron data has implications for international climate accords, which could harmonize with IAA sea level rise projections by mid-2026, another layer for your federal filings. Moving to science and technical developments, two items today that connect directly to our assessment and remediation workflows. Research on ocean warming shows it's disrupting whale migration and feeding, with Antarctic krill declines of 20–30% linked to warmer waters. This threatens rebounding populations under international protections, and in Canadian contexts, it intersects with federal SARA listings for species like North Atlantic right whales. For habitat assessments under the Fisheries Act, you'll need to factor in these accelerated warming projections. Compare that to BC EMA protocols for marine mammal risk in contaminated sites near pipelines. Practitioners on oil sands or Atlantic offshore projects should integrate this into IAA environmental impact statements. It could increase mitigation costs by 15% for acoustic monitoring or habitat offsets, and Saskatchewan AMPA mine tailings assessments may need updates for indirect aquatic impacts. It's confirming what many suspected about warming feedbacks, but the specifics on krill give us harder data for modeling. On a different note, field efforts in the U.S. on assisted tree migration show survival rates of 70–85% for relocated oaks and maples in warming zones, informing wildfire interface planning. In Canada, this aligns with Alberta EPA and Manitoba Environment Act requirements for reforestation and remediation. You can apply similar techniques to enhance monitored natural attenuation in fire-prone sites. Reference CCME soil guidelines for root zone contaminant uptake. For BCCSR projects incorporated into Protocol 1 risk assessments to mitigate heat island effects, potentially reducing long-term monitoring timelines by 2–3 years through resilient vegetation barriers. What this signals is a practical tool for climate-resilient remediation. Nothing revolutionary, but it could shave time off your project schedules if deployed right. For industry and practice updates, with spring field season approaching, prioritize groundwater monitoring prep under CCME guidelines. Calibrate pumps for method detection limits below 0.5 UG/L for PFAS via EPA method 1633 equivalents, and ensure in situ chemical oxidation pilots account for seasonal recharge. That's key to avoiding data gaps in variable weather. Update your remediation templates for permeable reactive barriers to include climate-resilient materials, which can reduce efficacy loss from freeze-thaw cycles in prairie provinces. If you're in Alberta or Saskatchewan, this could mean swapping in more durable media to maintain performance over winters. Also, brief your teams on Fisheries Act overlaps with provincial frameworks to avoid compliance gaps in wetland assessments. Think integrating SARA elements into EPA or EMA plans for smoother approvals. On the market side, these tweaks might add 5–10% to upfront costs for materials, but they pay off in reduced rework for projects like pipeline decommissioning or landfill assessments. And as I mentioned earlier, the cross-jurisdictional watch on U.S. developments could shift our carbon and transparency practices. Nothing immediate, but it underscores the need for flexible compliance programs. Now, action items. If you're working on coastal risk assessments in BC or Atlantic projects, review CCME marine guidelines for updates incorporating this low iron release data and adjust your models accordingly. If you're handling offshore developments, update SARA-compliant habitat models with the whale migration findings, and brief clients on the IAA implications to head off surprises. For Alberta remediation sites under EPA, incorporate the assisted migration data into reforestation plans and evaluate those cost impacts this week to keep budgets on track. Submit comments on the CPA PFAS list by March 15th, cross-referencing provincial thresholds like Quebec LQE to ensure your input reflects on-the-ground realities. And calibrate your lab methods for spring monitoring, ensuring PFAS detection aligns with ISO 17025 standards. Get that done before field teams mobilize. Looking at the week ahead, mark your calendar for March 10th, 2026, when the federal IAA consultation on climate adaptation metrics closes. Submit if you're on projects spanning multiple jurisdictions. March 15th, 2026 is the Canada Gazette deadline for CPA toxic updates, focusing on PFAS and emerging contaminants. March 20th, 2026, BC CSR vapor guidance feedback is due, which is relevant for Ontario and Alberta harmonization efforts. And March 31st, 2026, hits the Alberta EPEA Q1 reporting milestone for contaminated sites. Don't let that sneak up. Tomorrow, watch for more on potential CCME revisions tied to this Antarctic data, including how it might adjust thresholds for marine carbon modeling in federal assessments. That's environmental intelligence for March 3rd, 2026. If this briefing is useful to your practice, share it with a colleague and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We're back tomorrow. Have a productive day.